Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. I spoke with Ashley Hopkins-Benton of the New York State Museum about her work in recovering and presenting more LGBTQ plus stories within the collections of the museum, including the history of the Pride Center of the Capital Region, the longest continually operating center of its kind in the nation.
One of the things that's really interesting is there's a knowledge that came out in a lot of interviews that for some people, the Pride Center is absolutely a lifeline, and without it, they would not be around anymore. And for other people in the community, they never needed it for that reason, but they realize that it's really important that it's there for that reason. So I interviewed a lot of people that were both, that were supporters or who were very, very deeply and emotionally tied to the organization.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I am thrilled to be joined today by Ashley Hopkins-Benton. Ashley is a senior historian and curator at the New York State Museum. Her first book, Breathing Life into Stone, The Sculpture of Henry de Spirito, was published in 2013. She has curated or co-curated several widely celebrated exhibits for the State Museum, including Votes for Women, which marked the 2017 centenary of women's voting in New York State, and she co-authored with Jennifer Lemack the catalog of the same title, Votes for Women, and she has co-authored other works as well, including incorporating elements of art history, another specialty of Ashley's, into Erie Canal history in the recent work Enterprising Waters, which of course some of you have heard about in a separate episode of this program. Her current project for the museum has been spearheading incorporation of the stories of LGBTQ plus New Yorkers into the history presented at the State Museum. And as part of this initiative, she has put together a really important and exciting exhibition beginning this month, June of 2021, celebrating the Pride Center of the Capital Region. And I am so pleased for the opportunity to talk to her about that work today. So welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much.
I'm, first of all, would like to talk about your broader project of recovering LGBTQ plus stories within the museum's collections, as well as bringing them into the museum's story. I remember long ago, I think the last time I spoke with you at Researching New York 2019, I asked you what you were up to next, and you told me you were working on this. And of course I said, well, let's see some of it in New York History Journal, and hopefully we will at some point. But I'm wondering what, at that time when we were talking, what was and was not being presented at the State Museum?
Well, in terms of presenting things, almost nothing at the time, which is not to say that we didn't have things in the collections. I did find out in the archives well later, and actually in some of my interviews later, that the museum did exhibit part of the AIDS quilts that was in 1990. So that was totally a surprise to me. It's not something that we talk about anymore. But I started to dig in our collections, and I found little bits and pieces of stories that we weren't telling. We have a great collection called the Creative Women's Collective Collection, which is from an arts activism organization that was in New York City in the late 80s and early 90s. And within that, there's a couple pieces, the Gay Switchboard of New York poster and a I Support My Gay Child t-shirt are part of that collection. So those are things that we hadn't really had out yet. And then we have representation of some artists in the collection. So we have Bernice Abbott photographs, and we have a sculpture by Philip Johnson, and we have a recording of the original West Side Story. And those are all great queer stories that we weren't telling that part of their story at all. So the beginnings were really digging into that and seeing what we had to start with. And we did, the one thing that I will say that we really consciously collected was marriage equality. So in 2011, when New York State passed marriage equality, the curators did, and that was before I was at the museum, but the curators did go out and collect some materials, some signs and t-shirts and sashes and rings. So that was the one thing that we could say we really had a strong collection of.
It's interesting. I was able to see the sort of online presentation of artifacts that you did for the museum, and it was very clear that at that point, during the fight for marriage equality, the people working at the museum were very intentional because they realized that history was going on and they needed to be preparing to curate this. But your work in then recovering things that were already there that weren't being framed in a holistic way, really, has been important. But then also it's been, you've pointed out, it's been a matter of bringing in new materials. And one thing that I've picked up on is that you had a very generous donor, an activist named Pam Elam, and that was a pretty large collection that you were able to acquire as well.
Yeah, so Pam Elam first contacted us when we were working on women's suffrage, actually. And she is a lesbian activist in New York, very into politics, but also trained as a historian, which is wonderful because as she's gone through life, she's set things aside and documented things. And she approached us while we were working on suffrage because she had materials from a group that she founded called the Second Congressional Women's Union, which was fighting for passage of the ERA just before it timed out. And she came to us with a fantastic collection of photographs and written documents and newspaper coverage, all of which she organized by date and when they happened. And that was just a great boon to us being able to talk about the fight for women's rights in the 20th century. And we continued to communicate with her, talk with her about what we were working on. And I mentioned this project that we were trying to build our LGBTQ plus collections. And she said, well, I have things. She came out with things, and it's not just us that she's shared her wealth with. Her personal papers are in the collection of the Lesbian Her Story archives in New York City, so part of her story is documented there. But here she documented some of her political collections, things related to LGBTQ politicians that she worked with in New York City and at the statewide level. She also documented culture, so she would go to plays on Broadway or see movies that depicted lesbians, and she collected materials from those, which are just fantastic.
It's interesting, in your presentations of these artifacts, I've appreciated, even at this, I think it's still relatively early stage, the breadth and diversity of the materials. You just pointed out, it sweeps from activism and politics to the arts. What do you think at this stage are some of the strengths of your collection? And also, what are some areas, maybe it's all areas, but what are some areas where you're really actively seeking to bring in more at the moment?
I think that politics and activism is definitely a strength. certainly those materials in a way are easy to collect because there's the great political buttons and sashes and t-shirts. And here at the museum, it's a way to partner with Erin Noble, my coworker, who is the historian of politics, and we can work together on things like marriage equality or SANDA or GENDA, any of those great New York State pushes. So that's really useful. I think we need to continue building on the collections related to more socializing and leisure activities. We really don't tell that story. We don't have things, for example, from Fire Island or Cherry Grove, or from the gay bars, be it upstate or in New York City. And those are all really important stories to tell as well, and definitely still lacking. And also, we certainly still have a representation problem in that our collection of LGBTQ plus stories is very white still. So stories of people of color. We don't have many stories of trans New Yorkers yet. We don't have a lot of stories of bi or pan New Yorkers yet. So those are all things that I'd like to continue to build.
Excellent. And one element that you have pointed out, and that I think I noticed as well, is that the story within the museum's collections is somewhat New York City heavy. Mm-hmm. And that presents some obvious strengths, and there are some reasons for that, historical, some very meaningful things going on in New York City. But what are some benefits of the State Museum's strength in the New York City portion of this collection, and maybe what are some liabilities of that?
Well, I think you run the risk of having people think that all gay stories in New York are in New York City, and I think that's, everybody thinks of Stonewall, and you don't necessarily think about anything else. That said, I think there are great opportunities for partnership around the state. So as we work to build collections, especially from the Albany area, because we can do that and we have connections here, there are also organizations that are collecting elsewhere. The University of Rochester has the Empty Closet archives, which are fantastic. The University of Buffalo has a great collection. So I think there's a lot of room to start to work together with those organizations as well.
Great. And of course, as you point out, there is already an upstate presence in your collection, including especially perhaps from Albany. There's this story that you tell of this car, this bug that was defaced with just a cruel gay slur. But the woman who suffered this harassment, it's beyond harassment, it's bullying. It's we're trying to terrify someone, but she decided to use this as a symbol of empowerment. And you tell this story, if you don't mind telling this story, as it will be told at some point at the museum.
Sure. So Erin Davies was a student at the time, and she actually lived just down the street from the museum, less than a quarter mile away. And her Volkswagen Bug had a Rainbow Pride sticker on it, and it was defaced in 2007 with graffiti that said "You are gay," and just very crude graffiti. And I think most people, their initial reaction would be immediately, get it in the shop, get it removed. But she kind of stepped back and decided that perhaps it was an opportunity. So she actually took it on a 58-day cross-country trip where she talked to people about hate crimes. She talked to people about what was going on in their towns and spoke about what her experience was like. And out of that, she actually made a documentary, the first of two. And then after a year of traveling with it, she actually decided to put a rainbow wrap on the car. So she covered over the graffiti. And so the side of the car said "Fag Bug," which is what it came to be known. And she again toured the country. She went to all 50 states with it and went to colleges and universities and towns and continued to document hate crimes and talk to people about what that was like, experiences within the community, and then did another documentary out of it. And she drove it. There's a great listing that, the car has its own website, so it has a list of all the places that it was made appearances, all the colleges and universities and pride parades. It appeared here in Albany's Pride Parade at one point as well. And Erin contacted us when she was getting to the point where, you know, this had been a part of her life for like 10 years at that point, and she was ready for a new car that needed less repair. But she also realized that it was a really important story to preserve. So in our collections, we have the car, we have the original hood because she had to replace the hood. So we got the original that has the graffiti on it as well. And we don't have a set plan yet for exhibiting it, but it's been a part of a lot of discussions. So I hope that will happen someday.
It's so wonderful that she reached out to you. It starts out as such a sad and cruel story, and the way she flips that is so wonderfully empowering. And I'm sure to the people that would hear her speak, it probably meant so much as well. And so to be able to tell that story in some way or another is really great for the museum, and I'm glad that it's found its way into your collections. Now, one important way of bringing upstate and especially Albany more prominence in this history is your work with the Capitol Pride Center and their history. When you tell that story, you begin in this panel exhibit, which hopefully people watching this will hurry over and see. And you begin with pre-Stonewall era. And it's not just pre-Stonewall New York City or pre-Stonewall, you know, name the famous areas. It's pre-Stonewall Albany. And there are a lot of the same harassment and cruelty. And tell me what that story looked like in Albany before 1969.
Well, I think Albany is very similar to New York City. You know, there's no definite knowledge among the people that you talk to who were around at the time, but there was very much a sense that a lot of the bars were mafia owned. You know, they talk about entering the bars through cage-like structures, or the realization that there's only one way out, and that perhaps these places that they were hanging out were not the safest. But at the same time, they didn't have other places to go to meet like-minded people. I mean, that was where you would go to meet people that were also gay and had similar life experience. And beyond being in the bars, there's also talk of leaving the bars and getting beat up, not just beat up by random people on the street, but beat up by police on the street. And the idea that the police were driving by and taking down the license plates of all the people that were at these bars. And those records were in the police archives until pretty recently.
Wow. And so there are connections with the national story and with the Stonewall story, and the timing of the Stonewall uprising. Sometimes we hear historians say, look, that's one important moment, but it's not everything. And I think that's important to note. However, it seems like in this story, Stonewall, there is a direct connection, both chronologically and as far as the personnel. So what was that connection, first of all, and then how did that help transform what was going on in this capital region?
So the founders of what would become the Pride Center talked about meeting with who they called a drag queen, which was the terminology of the time, who had been at Stonewall. And we don't know exactly who that is, but it's likely that it was Sylvia Rivera. She's documented coming to Albany in 1970. So it's entirely possible that she was here slightly earlier than that documented event as well. And that person talked about what the experience was like at Stonewall and what the desires were moving forward in terms of getting greater rights. And so out of that, a group in Albany decided to get together and create the Tri-City Gay Liberation Front, which was a precursor to the Pride Center.
So after the spark of Stonewall and years of mounting frustration with all of these terrible indignities and harassment and bullying in the region, there's the creation of Tri-Cities Gay Liberation Front. And it seems like there's also this realization that, as you suggested, there aren't places to go except for these shady bars, which might be run by organized crime and dangerous and subject you to all this official harassment. And so the same organization then creates a community center. Talk about the beginning of this and how important it was right away.
So I should say, as it switched over, Tri-City Gay Liberation Front was formed very much as an activist organization, but it wasn't long lasting. It maybe lasted a year. And that kind of morphed into what would become the Capital District Gay Community Council. And in 1972, they were able to rent a space on Lark Street, at 250 Lark Street, that they saw as a community house. And this was supposed to be a space where they could hold meetings, they could hold peer support groups, they could hand out literature, have information for people that were looking for it, and also as a place where they could organize for more activist measures. So it was really kind of both. And then in 1974, they had the possibility of moving to Hudson Avenue, to 332 Hudson Avenue, first in a space that was rented, and soon they were able to purchase the building. And although that building has had immense challenges, it's a row house, a Victorian row house in Albany, so it's not accessible. It's had roof issues and plumbing issues and heating issues and lots of upkeep. It's been a home for them for that whole time period, a stable home and a place that is their own. And that became a safe haven in the city of Albany.
And if I understand the history correctly, this is the longest continually operating such institution. Is it the first in the nation, or is it only the one that's lasted the longest? But either way, it's a pioneering institution, right?
Yeah, it's not the first. In LA and San Francisco and New York, there were other organizations that were starting up right around this time period, but it is the one that has been run continuously. And certainly the first in this area.
Yeah, well, it's really critical. And you've been working very closely with the Pride Center to help them document their history. And this has been, I think, mutually beneficial for the museum and for the Pride Center. They're able to have a brilliant professional historian come in and help them document their story. And the museum is able to enhance its storytelling of its own. They actually produced this wonderful video that you were a critical part of, because you conducted these oral history interviews. And it comes through there, it comes through in the exhibit as well, these personal stories. I, as a historian, first of all, will compliment you on your really fine work in helping these people tell their story, right? And get their history as part of the history. And it's really profoundly moving to watch the video and to see the exhibit that's come out of this, to really be struck by the human element. And I was struck in hearing some of those interviews you conducted, by so much of what they were saying was phrases like, and I jotted down some quotes along the way, I was a ship lost at sea and the center was a lifeline. Several people used the phrase, it saved my life. Others speculate how many suicides were prevented just in the capital region as a result of this institution. And you sat in rooms with so many of these people, or in Zoom calls, depending on the case. I wonder if you can give a sense for how much the center meant to people early on, and how that comes through in your interaction with this history.
I wouldn't even just say early on. I think throughout history, and I was lucky that the breadth of people that I interviewed, and honestly, I still have some more people I want to reach out to, so I'm not quite done yet. But they interacted with the center at various points in their life. And one of the things that's really interesting is there's a knowledge that came out in a lot of interviews that for some people, the Pride Center is absolutely a lifeline, and without it, they would not be around anymore. And for other people in the community, they never needed it for that reason, but they realize that it's really important that it's there for that reason. So I interviewed a lot of people that were both, that were supporters or who were very deeply and emotionally tied to the organization. And it's important for various different reasons. They held peer support groups for different segments of the population, and those shifted over the years, depending on what was going on in the community. There's pretty much always been a gay men's support group, but other groups have changed. Certainly the youth group has become more important in recent years. But there's also the hotline that people can call when they need help, and help being, I need to find someone to talk to, I'm really down and out, or I'm new to the area and I haven't met anybody yet. What bar can I go to? Like it's the whole gamut. So I think it's really meant very different things to many people over the years, but important to all of them.
It's interesting too, because it came through in those conversations, as you just pointed out. Some people saw this as a lifeline, and others saw it. There's a real element of service that comes through in some. It's giving back, or it's helping to cultivate a community for those who don't have one. And that was really a beautiful story. It was interesting. A lot of people talked about early on finding the center. And becoming aware of it. So that, I think, is more of an early days story than in our own moment. But how did people find out about it early on?
Well, at the very beginning, word of mouth, certainly. And they were getting flyers out to gay bars and other places that people were gathering. They started publishing a newsletter right from the beginning in 1972. So that was brought out into the community, and it's always been free. They encourage people to support the publication, but there isn't like a subscription fee or anything. So that's one way. It also was in the phone book. Starting in 1976, it appeared in the Albany City directories. And that was an interesting story. So the organization changed names a couple times. It was the Capital District Gay Community Council. Then it was the Capital District Gay and Lesbian Community Council as representation grew. And then in 2011, they changed their name to the Pride Center of the Capital Region. And for some people, that was really inclusive term. It was a way to make sure that everyone in the community felt welcome. To others, taking the word gay out of the name was almost going backwards. It was hiding because they were the first organization to have gay in the phone book here. And that was really an easy way to find it if you didn't know exactly what you were looking for, especially.
It's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that, because I was going to ask later. I'll ask about it right now. As you point out, early on, this was a very male space, right? And how did they become more inclusive? Did they seek that out, or were there certain moments that were critical turning points?
It was a little bit of both, and it was interesting talking to some of the early male participants. There was very much a desire to get women involved, and they felt that if they were going to be doing activist work for greater rights, it was important to have lesbian women involved as part of that conversation. But at the same time, a lot of women didn't feel like it was the most welcoming place. On the other hand, it was a place where they could hold meetings, and there were women's groups meeting there pretty early. And one of my interviewees said, when we were there, it was a women's space. So it didn't matter what it was like as you were walking in, but once you got into that meeting room, that's what it was.
So I actually want to talk to you about those meetings, because it was a fascinating part of your interviews. On the one hand, people really gave you a really good sense of the tone of what was going on. And on the other hand, it was very clear that there are 40-year-old confidences that will never be broken. And that there's something very beautiful about that as well. But a lot of it wasn't, all sunshine. I mean, some of the stories that you hear, or at least you get a sense from people talking about the meetings, that they could be very dark. And I wonder what your sense was about that. And maybe, again, that's something that was necessary for these men and women, and that's the only chance they're going to have not to get even darker. But tell me your impressions of that.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that's important to note is that in the early years, this is before a lot of legal protections. So a lot more of the people that were attending the meetings were more closeted than perhaps they would be if you took a look at the meetings today. So you did have a lot of men who were attending the gay men support group who were still married. And in those marriages, sometimes their wives knew, sometimes they didn't. But that was maybe the only place that they could go to talk about that. There's talk about some of the women's meetings where there was very much a dichotomy between the white collar women who were working for the state or working for the university versus the blue collar women who had much more to fear in terms of losing their jobs, and they were much less able to be out. So a lot of those conversations happened too. But it was a safe place where they could talk about anything that they needed to, and they knew that it wouldn't leave the room at all.
You get a sense for the sort of tension in the room. One of the women you were talking to said that it was always very smoky. And that sort of struck me as you get this sense that people are just working through things, and it's really important. Now, another element of this story that is just intensely tragic is the HIV AIDS crisis. And one of the men you spoke to, it just jumped out at me. He said that 2/3 of the people that he had met when he first came to Albany in the 70s had died during the height of HIV AIDS crisis. And he said there was a point when it got into the hundreds and he just, for his own sake, had to stop counting. And I remember hearing him say that and hearing the tone of his voice as he's saying that and thinking, my gosh, this is, we know finally that history is becoming more and more a part of American history. And we know the sort of horrible national story, international story. What about the Albany story? What was the impact in Albany and on the center? How did it affect the center, afflict the center, but also how did the center help people during this crisis?
Well, I think that first thing to note is that there are so many voices that are not part of this oral history project because they're not around anymore. And a lot of the really pivotal people who founded the center and who were involved heavily in the early days are not around anymore. So that is a major impact just on the collective memory of that group of people. But one of the interesting things is that the community newsletter that they put out is archived. They have a full collection at the State University of New York at Albany. And you can watch as the AIDS crisis creeps in and it starts to get mentioned and it gets mentioned more. And ultimately, a group is formed, the AIDS Task Force of the Capital District, which is the precursor to the AIDS Council of Northeastern New York. And they actually had their offices in the Pride Center building for a number of years until they were able to get greater grant funding and move out into their own space just because of growth. So that was very much a presence at the center. They had their hotline at the center. They did numerous services there. So that was going on. In September of 1983 was when they first formed an AIDS support group. So in addition to those other support groups, and I said, they ebbed and flowed depending on what was going on. That's when one was created. And in June of 1985, an AIDS vigil was held as part of Pride Week. And I think that was the first time that happened. So it kind of creeps into just the everyday life and the activities of the center. The community newsletter, in addition to putting out information about drug trials that were happening at the hospital, or there was I think it was called the Men's Project, where they were tracking men who were being treated for HIV and their experiences and doing testing. that was advertised through the community newsletter. And then there was also a column by a man who was HIV positive and living through this time, and what his experiences were traveling or not being able to work, and just what everyday life was like. And certainly there were numerous people who talked about going to multiple funerals a week. It was a heavy time.
It's one of the things that seems to grow out of this tragedy on the national level, and I'm wondering if it was similar in Albany, is that this is a moment of forging a stronger alliance between gay men and lesbian women. Is that similar in Albany?
Absolutely. A lot of lesbian women in Albany and across the country were the ones who really stepped up as caretakers and as the advocating voices for better care and better treatment options.
Another element of this was growing political activism. And I'm especially interested in something you cover extensively in the panel exhibit, which is the local human rights ordinance. Can you talk about that story, sort of the spark and what they're fighting for, and how it turns out?
Sure. It's important to note too that the Pride Center itself, because it was a 501c3, and that was something they fought for that designation for a long time, they were very vocal about not being directly involved in political work. And it must be something that was said over and over and over again, because interviewees said it over and over and over again. So it was definitely emphasized, but it was a place that they could meet. A lot of political groups met there in that space. It was a place where they could get information out through bulletin boards and through the community newsletter. So it was really very closely connected with the political activism work. The group that took kind of the lead in political organizing on the local level is called the Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Club. And there's a lot of crossover between people that were on the board of the Pride Center and people involved in the Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Club. So the Human Rights Ordinance was suggested before there was statewide protections for LGBTQ individuals. New York State had not passed the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act yet. So there's no statewide protection, there's no federal protection. And activists in Albany argued that the Common Council could pass a law that would protect gay and lesbian and bisexual people. They weren't talking about transsexual people as much yet, but ultimately that would be wrapped into it. In housing, so that they could not be banned from housing or kicked out of their housing because they came out, in employment, in city services. So the law was first introduced in 1986 by Nancy Burton, who was a representative from the 6th Ward. And it's interesting to note she's the only straight ally that I've interviewed so far for this project. But her work on that project was so important. She was actually awarded by the Pride Center. They do annual awards. An award was named after her called the Straight But Not Narrow Nancy Burton Award. So she introduced it first. Jim Perry, who was very active at the Pride Center, was kind of the person who was pushing ahead efforts to get it pushed in the Common Council. A lot of it happened by way of flipping seats on the Common Council, so getting rid of people that were not supportive and getting new representation that would be supportive. One of the ways that they did that was through coalition building. So the 6th Ward in Albany, where the Pride Center is, was called the Gay Ghetto, or the center of activism. Certainly that was a focus. But they worked with representatives in other wards, and in particular, they worked with communities of color because they saw ways that they could partner and work towards the ways that both of those groups were being discriminated. So that was a big way that they did it as well. In 1989, Nancy Burton was up for re-election. She decided not to run again. And that was a major push where there were several people in the 6th Ward running, and also Keith St. John, who first ran in the 6th Ward, then moved to the 2nd Ward and ran successfully there. And when he was elected, he was the first openly gay Black man in the country to be elected to office. And with him in office, eventually the Human Rights Ordinance passed in 1991.
Did the passage of this important ordinance in the capital region, did it do anything to help change the conversation statewide?
Yes, and I will say Albany was not the only city in New York to do this. New York City has a similar law. I think Syracuse was a pretty early one, and Rochester as well. So it was happening piece by piece in different cities around the state. And yes, that definitely drove a push for a statewide law. And a lot of the same activists who were involved here in Albany stepped on to what would eventually become the Empire State Pride agenda to work at the state level.
Excellent. It's interesting because that's sort of that first generation of similar ordinances in the 1970s suffered so much pushback, and some of them ended up getting repealed. Was there any effort post 1991 by sort of reactionary? I mean, we don't need to give them a lot of airtime, but has there ever been a continued sort of, we need to fortify the gains that have been made and sort of entrench them, or has it been a sort of progress once created, once established?
There was pushback in the newspapers in Albany, but I don't think there was any real serious threat. And certainly it wasn't like, you know, all the common council seats got flipped. There's been more and more representation from the LGBTQ plus community on the Albany Common Council since then.
Clearly the Pride Center was not insular. It has a major outward facing presence, and not just in politics or sort of, they're not political, but you know, as a place where activists can come together. Talk about their footprint in the community. There's so many important examples that you cite. So talk about some of those.
Well, the thing about the Pride Center is that it is there as the kind of the primary means of contact between the community and the press. They are a voice. They are the ones that are organizing much of the Pride celebration in Albany. So that's a very visual way to communicate about what's going on in the community and who's part of it and how you can be involved. But it's also been kind of an incubator for a lot of other organizations, be it unofficially, because people meet through the Pride Center and they talk about common interests and then they go off and form their own thing, or through actual affiliates. So there are organizations that you know, pool resources with the Pride Center in terms of banking and, you know, official kinds of things. So there are both, and they both flourished, and they cover all kinds of different needs in the community and interests in the community. So Saratoga Pride is an LGBTQ plus organization in Saratoga that is an official affiliate, was spawned out of people that were traveling down to Albany to come to events here and realized that they really needed a center in their own community. So that's one way that they've been involved. But then there's also Capital Pride Singers, which is one of the only gay and lesbian mixed choruses left in the country. So that's here locally, and they at times have been supported by functions of the Pride Center, and certainly they've done events together collaboratively. There's Homo Radio, which is an LGBTQ plus radio show at RPI. And there's a lot of crossover there between people involved in the two organizations, and a lot of cross promotion. The Two Rivers Environmental Club was a group of people who like to go out and do canoeing expeditions and hiking and camping. So that was kind of a sub niche. And then I mentioned the Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Club, which was really the political arm. But then the other really important note is communities of color within the LGBTQ plus community. So early on, some of those groups formed kind of subgroups and meetings and found ways to connect with each other and really meet their needs. Some of the earliest ones were Sisters and Brothers in the Life, which is called SABLE, and the Gay Men of Color Alliance. And in those groups, there was still a lot of overlap, people that were on the Pride Center board and also involved in these organizations. And ultimately, the communities of color realized that they needed their own organization to be able to best advocate for their needs in the community. And so out of some of those smaller groups, a group called In Our Own Voices was formed. And they have their own community center in Albany and do really amazing activist work here in the community.
Really neat. And do the centers probably work together a lot too, or do they collaborate on events?
They didn't for a while, but it is something, and it was noted by a couple interviewees that they've started to collaborate more and that there's more partnership in the way that they're doing things. And I think it was particularly apparent at the beginning of the pandemic when they were doing some kind of more virtual events and collaborating together for those, which was good to see.
Good. And then there was something that they were talking about that I think is especially important in the new millennium, I'm guessing from the timeline, but they have the Alternative Prom. Is that put on by them? Tell me about that.
So the Alternative Prom was created because for a lot of LGBTQ plus youth, there was not the ability to attend prom. They'd attend their own school's prom with the partner of their choice for many years. That's changing now. But this was a place where they could go with whoever they wanted to attend with and really be themselves and also get them away from the isolation. You might be the only gay kid in school, but you go to the Alternative Prom and you get to meet kids like you from other schools in the area.
And then there are parades and celebrations and a lot of just very sort of not only affirmative, but celebratory and public, and some of it, you see some of the images, almost like a carnival, fun atmosphere. The center seems to have done a great deal to cultivate allies throughout Albany, throughout the region. I was struck by one of the interviewees. He said, sort of how warm he felt. He clearly was touched by the fact that there was this presence of non-LGBTQ plus families and children at their events. And this is something he said you never would have seen decades ago. And then it seemed very important to him. How has that changed over time? And how has this sort of outward facing Pride Center presence helped that?
Well, I think in the early years, it was important first to find community and find support for each other, and then to start to push for greater rights. And along the way, one of the things they realized was that it was easier to argue for rights if you knew someone personally who was part of the LGBTQ plus community. So a very conscious effort was made to get people to come out and to have the experience of, my coworker or my friend or my family member is part of that community and it's their rights that you're fighting for. So I think that has really become a very important part of public events like Pride that show that these are real people in our community and it's important that we care for them and protect their rights.
In so many of your interviews, again, one of the great strengths of that and of the exhibit, there's so much, it's just a very humane presentation. And I think that's really the point, right, is letting these people tell their stories and letting their story be sort of heard. And again, it's sometimes very uplifting. You hear about people who after decades feel happy because the community's rallying around them now. And on the other hand, you still hear these stories about those dark stories of people who maybe felt hopeless. Along the way, the center seems to have been part of that transformation. And I'm wondering, what you think the legacies are of the first 50, and maybe not what you think, but what you think now, having gone through these interviews and having talked to all these people. What would you point to as some of the key legacies of the first half century of the Pride Center?
I think definitely the community that it provided, and the sense of belonging it provided people, which then allowed them to turn around and go back out into the community and fight for rights, is very important. It was interesting to me the number of people I heard who were not totally out, and something happened in the community. There was a raid, or I forget what else exactly, but there were things that happened that came out in the news, and they outed themselves in the news because it was important to stand up for the Pride Center and for those rights. So I think it gave them a platform for greater comfort and to feel like they had the ability to fight for those rights. And that's really important. And I will say that there were growing pains early in the center. We talked a little bit about inclusion of women, and the fact that the community of color felt like it needed a separate space because their needs were not being served there. And that discussion continues today. The trans community is still not feeling totally welcome in all of these spaces. So there's continued work that needs to be done from the Pride Center in helping to represent that whole community.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What's next on their agenda moving forward, as far as what are they hoping to continue? Is it building on what they've done, or is it, as you say, becoming even more inclusive? From these interviews, what do the members of the community, the people who work at the Pride Center, what do they see as their future?
I think that there is a desire for continuing to welcome greater diversity in the center, and to really reach out to other members of the community that are maybe being less served. There has been a changeover on the board, and there's new energy. I think they're also really still trying to figure out how to deal with the pandemic. I mean, certainly like all of us, they pivoted and they offered things online. But there are specific ways that it impacted that community differently than others. So they're working through that. And right now we're in the middle of Pride Month, and it's a Pride Month that they couldn't plan 6 months or 9 months in advance like they normally would. It was kind of planned on the fly over the last couple of weeks because they didn't know what was being allowed. So it's all new and changing, and kind of a struggle. And I think they're working through that. And I suspect there have been various times where the board has really sat down and worked on what their new vision is. One of them was when they changed the name to the Pride Center. And I would expect that would probably happen again sometime soon too.
And then, of course, something that you won't just have an educated anticipation, but you are the person who will make these decisions. What's next for the museum when it comes to telling this important story and making it a bigger part of the history that's presented there?
Well, as I said, I have more interviews I want to do as part of this project. I think it's really, really important to include diverse voices. And not only do these interviews inform the exhibit and inform the video, but they will be part of our archive. So they are becoming part of our collection. And I think that's really important looking to the future to have those archived here. I am working on a manuscript on these interviews. It is in the beginning stages. It has a lot of work to go, but I'm really looking forward to incorporating a lot of the words out of the interviewees in addition to my own writing. So I think that's an important step forward, and getting images out of the archives to share that otherwise would not be seen very often. And then one of the important things too at the museum is really making sure that LGBTQ+ stories are included in exhibits going forward. So as we plan anything, thinking about how we can be more inclusive.
Well, that's all Wonderful to hear, and I'm actually really excited about the maybe other people knew already, but it's news to me about the manuscript, so I'm really enthusiastic to hear about that because, as I said, the way you were able, even in this relatively contained space of this particular exhibit or of this the oral history video that was put together, the way you were able to so humanely allow people to tell their stories and to really bring viewers or people experiencing the exhibit into a more profound understanding of what people had been through and what all of this history meant to them, and to just make this history part of the history, because it is. You were so effective at that, and I'm so glad to hear that you're going to be doing more. And when the manuscript's out, or if anything else comes out along the way, I hope that you'll come on here and talk to me about it. Ashley, I'm so grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your great work, and I will hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thank you.